Hello and welcome to this introduction to the book of Job. In a previous lecture, I discussed wisdom literature in general, kind of defined wisdom and foolishness, talked a little bit about the theology of the book of Proverbs, which essentially is, if you live out the lifestyle described in the book of Proverbs, you should be, all things considered, successful, wealthy, healthy. You should live a happy life. Yet, when we read the book of Job, here's a character who seems to have lived out the proverbial wise life. He was the wisest man in all of the East, yet in his life he ends up kind of being tortured. So we'll cover some of the contents of the book, and then we'll talk about the theology of this most unusual book in the Old Testament. First, by way of introduction, the book is named for the central character, Job, although there is some question as to what his name might actually mean. Similar to a Hebrew word which means enemy, and so some scholars have suggested the name means enemy of God, which might be how he feels in the book, since he's having all these unjust things happen to him. But it really doesn't really capture the character of Job very well. There is an Arabic word which is similar to Job, which means repent, or even someone who is penitent, someone who is repenting of their sins. And so some have suggested that's where this name comes from, but we really don't know for sure about that. As far as the contents of the book of Job, the date of the book of Job, there are no historical references in the book. And so as a result, you get suggested dates of composition for this book as early as 2000 BC, so time of Abraham, and as late as the 1st or 2nd century BC, so almost to the time of Christ, at least post-exilic, if not into the Maccabean period. There are some reasons for this, and I have quite a few of those on page 221 in your notes, just to highlight a couple of those in favor of a later date, so one that's closer to the 1st century, sometime in the exilic period. A lot of this has to do with technical arguments concerning language, the Aramaic, influences on the Hebrew, especially in the poetry sections. Probably the most important is the last point I make under point B, that there's a more mature theology. So in Proverbs, some of the earlier material, you have two ways. You can go the way of life or the way of death, and there seems to be no options. Yet in Job, here's a person who's gone the way of life, yet horrible things happen to him. So people are thinking through, how does a wisdom lifestyle work? So that would suggest maybe a little bit later date. In favor of an early date, there's been some studies done that compare the Hebrew of the poetry sections to a large cache of Canaanite literature known as the Ugaritic literature. And there's some legendary stuff in there and some things that are sort of interesting. But the point here is that the Hebrew language looks more similar to that than it does later Aramaic flavored Hebrew. Very technical, very linguistically based, but there is at least an argument to be made for the book sounding like it comes from an earlier time. And there are some parallels in Egyptian literature that date much earlier. What I'm talking about here, it's possible to date maybe the poetic sections of the book, so the middle 30 or so chapters, as coming from a later date, but the prose, the story part of the book of Job, come from an earlier time. And there's some good reasons to consider the book of Job coming from an earlier time. For example, if you look on page 222, I list 3 things here. One is when Job's wealth is described, his wealth is described in terms of sheep and goats and agricultural sorts of things, not silver and gold. So at the time of Solomon is rich, fantastically rich, and we're told that he has, all gold implements in his temple and in his palace, and silver is as common as rock, that sort of thing. So earlier in the history, when Abraham is described as rich, he has lots of sheep and goats. When Solomon is described, he has lots of cash, if you want to think of it that way. Job makes his own sacrifices in the story. Again, this would be difficult to understand if this were written after the time the temple was rebuilt, or even in the exile, when nobody would have thought of making their own sacrifices. And the fact there isn't a temple, there is no tabernacle. He doesn't go up to Shiloh and worship at the tabernacle or something like that. It seems like this story is really old, goes back to the time, say, of Abraham. It fits into the context of Abraham's stories really well, say 2000 BC, although the theology of the book seems to reflect a later date. So perhaps the story is of ancient origin, but the central sections of the book are more sort of philosophical or theological writings from a later time. It's a possibility anyway. One compelling factor for dating the book is the idea of Satan. The book describes Satan as coming before God, and he's acting as God's adversary, being given permission to test and even torment the character of Job. And some of those ideas are things that are found in Judaism, but only after the exile. So the name Satan, which just basically means adversary, that doesn't come up in other Old Testament texts until Chronicles, which is clearly written after the exile. So the fact that the book has Satan as a character and an adversary seems to reflect a later time. Again, the story likely happened, a long time ago in a galaxy far away, so to speak. But it actually is written maybe a little bit more closer to the exilic or post-exilic era. Let's talk about the contents of the book. Job is described in the book as an upright nobleman, and I just want to read a little bit of the book here. Didn't have my Bible open. I guess that's poor planning on my part. So you get to hear me page through to find the book of Job. In Job chapter 1, in the land of Uz, that's U-Z, you can actually follow along on the screen for a little bit there, can't you? In the land of Uz, U-Z, not Oz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and he shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep and 3,000 camels and 500 yoke of oxen and 500 donkeys. And he had a large number of servants, and he was the greatest man in all of the East. His sons used to hold feasts in their homes and on their birthdays, and they would invite the 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And when the period of feasting had run its course, Job would make arrangements to have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, "Perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." This was Job's regular practice. Well, we're told that this great man of the East, wealthy, blessed with not just a few children, but 10 children, in the ancient world, it's kind of unusual. The perfect ratio is to have 10 children, 7 sons, and 3 daughters. 7 sons was considered ideal. You top that off with 3 daughters for an even 10. That would be a truly blessed man. Well, what happens in verse 6 is that Satan and the other angels are presenting themselves before God, and God himself brings Job to Satan's attention. And he says to Satan, "Have you seen my servant Job? There's nobody else like him." And Satan points out, well, of course, you've kind of given him everything he ever wants. Take that stuff away from him, and he will curse you to your face. And so Satan is given permission to take Job's possessions. So this begins in verse 13. One day when Job's sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, "The oxen were plowing and the donkeys were grazing nearby, and the Sabaeans attacked and made off with them, and they put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The fire from God fell from the heavens and burned up all your sheep and the servants, and I'm the only one who has escaped to tell you." While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, "The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and swept down on your camels and made off with them, and they put the servants to the sword, and I am the only one who's escaped to tell you." And while he was still speaking, yet another messenger came and said, "Your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking in the oldest brother's house, and Suddenly a mighty wind swept down from the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It collapsed and they're dead, and I'm the only one who escaped to tell you. So within the time it takes to read those dozen or so verses, Job has lost all of his possessions, all of his animals, all of his wealth, and all of his family. How does Job react to this? Verse 20, at this, Job got up and tore his robe and shaved his head. He fell onto the ground in worship. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I will depart. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. And in all this, Job did not sin by charging God with wrongdoing. In chapter 2, another scene in heaven, like had happened in chapter 1, God once again points Job out to Satan and says, even though you incited me against him, he still has not cursed me. And Satan points out, well, yeah, a man will give anything to have his health, and you've kept him healthy. Take away his health and he'll curse you. And so Job is struck with a very painful affliction. It says he's covered in sores from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. And as he's sitting here in mourning, wearing sackcloth and ashes, he takes a piece of pottery and he's scraping at these horrible, painful sores, and yet he still does not curse God and die. It is interesting, though, that Satan never took his wife, and so in verse 9, as he's scraping himself in the ashes, his wife said to him, "Are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die." Job replied, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" And in all this, Job did not sin in what he said. I suspect that perhaps the wife was allowed to remain to sort of continue to test Job. So Job is sitting in these trials. He has never cursed God. He's not blaming God for what has happened. And that sets the stage for three friends to arrive. These three friends have heard that Job has had just horrible things happen to him. They come to sit with him, and for 7 days they sit in silence and allow Job to maybe weep and sort of experience the emotions. Unfortunately, after those 7 days, they begin to speak. And you have this dialogue between the three friends who are watching Job suffer and Job. And basically, I have here on pages 223 all the way through to 220, top of 225, kind of a summary of each of these speeches. Each of the men offer a suggestion to Job. Why are these horrible things happening to you? And just to sum up kind of what all three of them say 3 times each, Job, you're sinning. God is punishing you. And Job's response is, in each case, I have not sinned, therefore God cannot be punishing me. And so they suggest, well, maybe it's a secret sin. You think you're getting away with it. Or maybe it's an accidental sin. You sinned and you didn't realize it yourself. Job maintains his integrity all the way through these cycle of speeches, all the way through chapter 31. And then this fourth person, Elihu, a younger man, was there. And he has 4 speeches that Job doesn't even bother responding to, that talk about God's sort of just care for the universe. He is a wise and just God. So, Job, if you're sinning, you're being punished justly. Well, Job never admits that he has sinned. He has always done the righteous thing. He has always he really has lived out the Proverbs wisdom lifestyle, yet he's suffering. And so he says, I'm not going to make any answer anymore until the Lord himself gives an answer to why I'm suffering. And so the last several chapters of the book, beginning in chapter 38, pardon me, are the speeches from the Lord. In the first speech, which you can see there is 2 full chapters, the Lord accuses Job of speaking in ignorance. And rather than come to Job and say, you're right, Job, you're an innocent man, and I've been letting Satan have his way with you for reasons, he basically tells Job, you're a human being and I'm God. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Where were you when I created this or created that? I have control over the foundations of the world And who are you, Job, to question what I am doing? So the Lord basically defines himself out as the creator God who's absolutely sovereign and can do whatever he wants to. So Job, you little human, you're speaking in ignorance. Well, Job's response is humble silence. He actually says, I've spoken too much already, and so he will remain silent. In the Lord's second speech, he uses the example of two, I call them here on the screen, mythical beasts, the behemoth and the leviathan. Now, the behemoth and the leviathan, if you have a ESV study Bible, there's usually a footnote that says maybe a hippopotamus, maybe an alligator. So take the two most fearsome animals you could think of. God is more powerful than those. Well, a lot of people will point out that the descriptions of Leviathan, behemoth, maybe they're dinosaur-like, and sometimes you'll hear Ken Ham at the Creation Museum kind of talk about how these sound like dinosaurs. Well, if you read the descriptions, they really sound even more than that. Leviathan is, and this is a picture of an Assyrian wall art of Leviathan. Leviathan is a chaos beast. He's the mythical chaos beast, or I should say she is the mythical chaos beast that sort of ruled the world before the gods imposed order. Behemoth is very similar to that, a gigantic beast that a human cannot possibly control. So as you read these chapters, God says, take Leviathan and Behemoth. Well, maybe it's a hippopotamus and a gigantic alligator, crocodile. No human being walks up to a hippopotamus and pets it and says, good boy, because they'll just chop you in half. I've seen hungry hippos. I know how it works. But you do find out hippopotamuses are the most dangerous animals to humans. They're just fierce creatures. You keep your distance from them. Well, even if they're dinosaurs, maybe Ken Ham is right, and these are, I don't know, Brontosaurus, which I don't even think exists anymore, and a T-Rex or an Allosaurus or something. Again, nobody walks up to those creatures and sort of pats them on the head. And nobody would approach these chaos beasts, out of your worst nightmares, and treat them like they're animals. My favorite line in the whole section is that God takes Leviathan, this thing that sounds like a dragon-like creature, and he takes it and he puts it on a leash. He puts it in a cage like a bird. He puts it on a leash and lets his little girls play with it. So if you can imagine, you got a couple of small children, you give them a puppy, you give them a kitty. Well, from God's perspective, the monster from your worst nightmare, that's just like a little kitty. I let my kids play with that. So how powerful is God? He's more powerful than anything in all of creation, anything in the mythologies of the Assyrian, the Babylonian, the ancient Near Eastern world. Well, Job's response to the second speech is once again a humble silence. He responds to God with a contrite and repentant heart, even though he has not committed a sin that he thinks he's worthy of judgment over. He has spoken rashly and he repents before God. Well, the book ends with a kind of a restoration. It's only about 10 verses. The three friends are told to make sacrifices, beg Job to pray for you because you're in the wrong. Then Job's wealth is restored to him, and he has 10 more children. He has 7 boys and 3 daughters. And the 3 daughters, we're told, kind of the last lines of the book, are the most beautiful women in all of the world. And so everything that Job had before has been restored to him. So what is this story about? A lot of times people will approach the book of Job as answering the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Job is apparently a good person and horrible things happen to him. So it's supposed to answer the question of, why do good people suffer? And unfortunately, that's not really what the point of the book is. When it comes down to it, the book doesn't argue that God is just, and if bad things happen to you, you're being justly punished. Or God is unjust. He's some sort of sick, monster in heaven just torturing whoever he wants to. It basically just says God is God and you're a human. Understand your place in the cosmos. To use a modern phrase, stay in your lane. God is God. Don't go into his lane and tell him how to run the universe. Job's response really comes down to that a person should do good things because you should do good things. If you choose to do a good thing, you do it because it's the right thing to do, not because you're expecting to be punished or you're expecting to be rewarded. Yeah, by way of analogy, when you were a little kid, 5, 6, 7 years old, your parents told you to clean your room. Now, if you're like a normal child, you probably didn't keep your room very clean. And your parents either punished you if you didn't clean your room, or maybe they rewarded you when you did clean your room. So kind of the carrot or the stick, the punishment or the reward. Well, at some point in your life, and hopefully you're kind of getting there, you realize sometimes it's best if I kind of clean up my own filth. Maybe it's a bad idea to keep a glass of milk under my bed for 3 months. Maybe it's a bad idea if I just have a pile of dirty clothes that I select the least wrinkled thing each day. Maybe I should clean up my own room and take care of my own things. And you choose to do the good thing, live kind of healthy, because it's the right thing to do. That's what Job is teaching. It's teaching us that God does reward, God does punish, but you do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, whether God chooses to reward you or punish you or not. Really, Job deals with this question by asking, is there really an innocent sufferer? Now, I sort of resist this a little bit because it's hard for me to look at a child who has been, suffered horribly and say, oh, that person deserved what they got. But in general, from an adult perspective, we all know that we aren't particularly innocent. Maybe we don't deserve the horrible disease we got, or we don't deserve to deal with this death in the family or whatever. But everybody in the world suffers because of the effects of sin, and we all suffer equally. Job really questions the idea of a theology of retribution. A theology of retribution says, I sin, therefore I get punished, or I did good stuff, so therefore I get rewarded. To be honest with you, that's more of a Santa Claus approach to theology, that we think God's in heaven like Santa Claus, rewarding the good little children and punishing the bad little children with gifts and coal or whatever that happens to be. Job's friends, in fact, assume that that's why Job is suffering. You suffer because you sinned, Job. You're suffering now, so you must have sinned. Well, Job himself and the book of Job rejects that theology of retribution. God does not necessarily punish people who are being wicked, and he doesn't necessarily reward people who are being good. Honestly, just take a look at the world today and see who gets ahead in life. Are they godly people, millionaires and billionaires and people who are famous and people who have lots of, worldly possessions or political power? Oftentimes they're horrific people, yet somehow they have been successful. Job, I think, reflects the very real world where God does not immediately punish or immediately reward our behaviors. After all the attempts to sort of explain what was going on, as you're reading the book, you might expect God to appear and defend himself. Like, no, Bildad, that's not what I said. Here's what I mean. He doesn't even tell Job why he has suffered the way he has at the end of the book. Can you imagine if he had, though? He appears at the end of the story and says, yo, Job, Satan and I were chit-chatting about you in heaven, and I decided to let Satan torture you. I mean, how's that going to go over? I can't imagine Job being really happy with that either. In fact, the book of Job describes God is ultimately free. Job and his friends are baffled by this. They think God works a certain way, but God can work any way that he wants to. He has freedom in the story to behave in ways that are surprising. The old saying, God works in mysterious ways. Well, Job is an excellent example of that. God works in ways that correct misconceptions, human misconceptions about God. God is even free to deal with Satan. Now, I didn't talk about this when I was going over the story of the book, but just imagine that God and Satan are in heaven having a chat. Now, this is not one of of those cheesy memes on the internet where God and Satan are sort of arm wrestling over the planet Earth. This is Satan as an angel. Satan is a created being, recognizing that God is his sovereign Lord and answering his questions as he is supposed to. But God can intervene in the story. God can not intervene in the story. In fact, what's really interesting is Satan doesn't even come back at the end of the story. He's just a tool that God uses to advance the theology of the book. And the theology of the book really comes down to that God is not bound by our beliefs about him. This is sort of humbling to me because I teach this stuff all of the time, but just because I believe God acts a certain way doesn't necessarily mean that God has to sort of go by my rules. If God wants to, God can do far more than I can possibly imagine. Job certainly describes God as absolutely free to work in any way that he wants to. Well, that's it for Job. Let me do one thing here at the end. By way of attendance, you might be wondering, how do I get attendance for these lectures? What I'd like you to do, like a good YouTuber, leave a comment, subscribe to my channel, that sort of thing. Leave a comment in the comment box so I know that you were here. You made it all the way to 25 minutes into the lecture. And then I'd like you to maybe give me a little bit of a survey answer here. I'd like you to know if you prefer to have a synchronous class that meets during the Google Meet, meets during a particular time on Google Meet. So you have to come into the class at 1 o'clock and you have to be online during 1 o'clock to 2:30, and then I present the lectures sort of live and in person via Google Meets. Or would you prefer to do the class asynchronous, which means videos like this that you can watch anytime you'd like, and I suspect at any speed you like, because I think you can speed these up, 1.5 or 2 times. But it doesn't give you the structure of, oh, it's Tuesday at 1 o'clock, I need to be in class. It gives you the chance to be able to watch the videos when you'd like to, where you'd like to, on whatever device you'd like to. So any feedback would be helpful there. This is sort of an ongoing debate among all college professors everywhere, whether students would prefer a synchronous class or an asynchronous class. I would just suggest, if you prefer the synchronous class for these videos, you just watch them at Tuesday at 1 o'clock and, pretend you're in class, I guess would be the way to do that. So go ahead and give me feedback. Definitely put it in the YouTube comments below. And if you put those on the class evaluation, that would be helpful as well. All right, I'll see you in the next lecture, or I guess I'll see you in the next lecture on Ecclesiastes.